Well, in any conversation about the future of the St. Louis region, it's not hard for people of various backgrounds and philosophies to agree educating our kids is key to our success. Disagreements arise when it comes to how we should educate, and in the past month, those disagreements have become even more passionate, to say the least. There's a $42 million court fight for money St. Louis Public Schools believes it is owed, and SLPS is suing the state to get it. Money meant to fund desegregation programs. Money that currently also helps fund charter schools in the city. Money charter schools say they need to survive. So now the debate between traditional public education and charter schools has, well, intensified with this lawsuit. A lawsuit that is complex and can be confusing. And tonight, we hope to better understand what's going on and what's at stake. So stay tuned.
So we're going to do the show.
Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 network of public media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned.
15 to the roll. 45,
There's been a lot of talk about this subject in the past month, but how much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction? That is hard to say, since this is an issue that's being fought in court and parties involved are, well, they say they're not able to comment while it is in court. Unfortunately, that has led to a lot of misinformation about the history and context of this issue. One thing everyone can agree on, this is a complex situation with decades of history behind it. Tonight, we dive a little deeper to get the history and the roots of this topic and to go beyond the war of words waged in social media and try to bring a little light to this issue, an issue that could shape the education landscape of our city. First, let's get up to speed with a brief history of what got us to this point.
The fight to desegregate St. Louis city schools began in 1972 with a court case brought by 5 African-American families that came to be known as the Liddell case. After years of fighting in court, it was decided in 1983 that the state of Missouri would establish the Voluntary Interdistrict Coordinating Council, or VIC program, which set up the system that bused city students to county districts. The state of Missouri paid the cost for the VIC program. In 1999, all the plaintiffs in the case agreed to a plan that continued the VIC program and instituted a 2/3 cents sales tax in the city of St. Louis to take over the funding of the programs. The distribution of these tax dollars is the reason for the motion filed by the St. Louis Public Schools against the state of Missouri, which brings us to the current fight over funds to educate St. Louis students, with potential impacts beyond money. How does this suit impact the education landscape of our region, and what's at stake outside the classroom?
Well, we talked about how a lot of people who are involved in the litigation can't talk, say they can't talk because it is in litigation, but we do have some voices both on tape from previous interviews this week, also in the studio, and then also from what we're hearing and learning and the questions we're getting from you on Facebook, Twitter, Shine Big, other social media platforms. So let me introduce our guest here in the studio first. Dale Singer, education reporter, St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back to the show. Also, welcome back to James Schulz, now assistant professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. One thing I saw on Facebook this week, somebody said, you know, I don't know if everybody's on the same page about what a charter school is. So just to be sure that we're all on the same page, a charter school, define the charter school for me.
Charter school is a public school. A charter school is paid for by tax dollars. It's not part of the St. Louis public school system. It's an independent school. It has a sponsor. It has a board, but it's paid for by tax dollars. So there are 2 kinds of public schools in the city of St. Louis, the district schools and the charter schools.
And who can go to a charter school?
Any student within the district can go to the charter school.
And you say, and how is it paid for? Paid for the public with tax dollars. And in this case, you know, my next question is, who's suing whom here? The tax dollars, some of which the city, St. Louis Public Schools would argue, were not meant to go to charter schools. Is that a fair estimate of the,
right,
the larger issue?
Part of the proceeds from the sales tax. They say they should get them all. The state has been giving some of it to the charter schools for the last 10 years. the city schools and a couple of other parties have sued to get that money back.
We got here because the courts stepped in after a lawsuit and said, St. Louis, you're behind the times, desegregate your schools. The state legislature eventually decided they no longer wanted to pay for it. Stop me when I'm wrong here. So the city passed a sales tax to tax itself to pay for the desegregation efforts in the city schools. And then somewhere along the way, charter schools came in and some of that money started to go to the charter schools.
Right, so charter schools were authorized or passed through the legislature at the same time that the legislature stepped in and said, we're going to give the district the authority to levy a sales tax to take over paying for this transfer.
Was that all part of a compromise, a political compromise? We want charter schools, we want to be able to also raise some money through a tax.
Well, I think all of this was part of a conversation at that time. What do we do with this school district, a district that had been struggling for a very long time? We've been struggling with this desegregation issue since the 70s when this Liddell case first went to the courts. So by 1998 or 99, whenever these issues are getting wrestled out in the legislature, yes, it's very much a compromise where people are saying we want more choice, and then we also want to allow the district to take over paying for this transfer program.
My understanding is that the charter schools were put in there to win support from people who may not have supported it otherwise.
The idea of the city being able to raise that sales tax.
Right, and also to, as James says, provide more choice.
Okay, let's go to an interview we did earlier this week. This is Bill Dothett, one of the men in the room for a lot of the discussions that we're talking about, specifically representing the Liddell plaintiffs.
The St. Louis school desegregation case began as the desire of a group of parents who didn't want their children transferred. The black parents in North St. Louis began to organize, began to attend board meetings, again wanting the same equal treatment that was being extended to the white parents. In February of 1972, what we know now as the Liddell desegregation case was filed. The Court of Appeals ordered, upon their finding from the facts that desegregation was warranted, that the schools of the city of St. Louis be promptly desegregated, and suggested several techniques that would comply with constitutional requirements for desegregation. As a result, the 1983 interim settlement agreement was approved. This is what the court found on July 5th, 1983. For 29 years, black school children of St. Louis have been urging the fulfillment of the promise of constitutional equality. For 29 years, Missouri has created new programs and expanded old ones with funds that should have gone to students whose constitutional rights have been violated. The constitutional responsibility must now be faced. The parties reached a comprehensive final settlement, a binding enforceable contract that gives both rights, responsibilities, but also accountability on all sides for ensuring high-quality integrated public education for St. Louis public school students. The goal was that every child, white, black, Latino, from other ethnic groups, was to receive a high-quality integrated public education. Our negotiations hinged on funding for a desegregation remedy. Minnie Liddell is on record in support of the desegregation sales tax. A promise was made that if the taxpayers of the city of St. Louis would approve a 2/3 of 1 cent sales tax increase specifically targeted to funding long-term desegregation remedies, there would be an ongoing, untouched stream of funding for their benefit. The dollars were specifically allocated upon collection to St. Louis Public Schools through either the Transitional School Board, the City Board of Education, or its current successor, the Special Administrative Board. Those funds are held in trust as part of funding for the desegregation remedy and the desegregation remedy alone. So for those who would say that the Special Administrative Board, in filing this action, again, I do not speak for that board. I do not speak for the other plaintiffs, but I do speak on behalf of the Liddell plaintiffs. We believe that that fiduciary relationship requires that every effort be made to collect the proceeds of the desegregation sales tax and to ensure that each 2/3 of a cent is properly applied for the desegregation remedies for which we settled the case. Using funds, diverting them to another purpose, I would suggest is a violation of the settlement agreement. This is not and should not be construed to be a dispute, a contention, a confrontation between parents of St. Louis public school students and parents of students who attend public charter schools within St. Louis City. Those are two different groups. There is a common factor: limited dollars due to inaction by the Missouri legislature. Children and their education should be valued. It should be a priority to promote the highest level of funding absolutely possible to make sure that our most valued resource, our children, receive the highest quality, integrated public education wherever they are. A joint motion for enforcing a provision of the settlement agreement was filed by the two plaintiff groups, the Liddell plaintiffs and the Caldwell NAACP plaintiffs, with the Special Administrative Board of the St. Louis Public Schools. The request is that the desegregation sales tax proceeds needed for the financing of the desegregation remedies my clients are entitled to under our settlement agreement has not been fully funded. Funds have been diverted. We are asking for the restoral of the status quo, that our plaintiffs, the Liddell plaintiffs, as stated in our pleading, receive what the settlement agreement says they are entitled to. We seek nothing more.
Specifically, about $42 million over the course of the past 10 years since the funds that were agreed to in this sales tax in 2006 started going to charter schools as well.
Right.
Is that accurate?
Because of a change in the way the state distributed money, change in the foundation formula, which is what they use to fund public schools.
Just want to briefly echoing a little bit of that sentiment. Faith Sandler, who works in the nonprofit area of the education world, but wrote as a regular citizen to the Post-Dispatch and a letter to the editor, said that district leadership could rightly be accused of abrogating primary fiduciary responsibility. In other words, not doing their job if they didn't file this suit. She said, what corporate CEO would not file suit to claim funds to which the company is entitled? That is the position, even though they won't come on and say it because they're entitled in court. That's essentially the position of St. Louis Public Schools. Fair?
Right. I mean, if you owed me $42 million, you better believe I'm going to sue you for it, right? So I think we can all agree that if they believe that they're entitled to it, that they absolutely should be pursuing those funds. I mean, it would be them falling down in the line of duty if they didn't. So I think we can certainly agree to that.
However, that has ramifications. What would happen if they get the $42 million? Charter schools shut their doors?
The law says that if the charter schools got money that they were not entitled to, they have to pay it back. It's not the state that pays it back. They have to pay it back, and a lot of them are saying they just couldn't keep their doors open if they had to do that.
And typically the way it happens is the state sends the dollars to the charter schools, and when there's a discrepancy and they were supposed to pay some back to the state, basically the state just withholds those dollars. And so if the charter schools had to fund money back to the public schools, what they could do is essentially withhold funding from the charter schools to give back to the district. And if they weren't able to receive those funds, absolutely it could bankrupt them.
So the St. Louis Public Schools is not directly suing charter schools, just to make that clear. However, this could have radical ramifications for education in St. Louis, correct?
Absolutely.
And the schools, the public schools have talked with officials of the state and said, we think you're not doing this right. And after those talks, I believe they were in February, the state came back and said, no, we think we're doing it according to the law. I mean, that's why it's in court, because both groups have the same facts, but they have different interpretations.
I think that's where it's important to look at the other side. As I said, I could very much see why St. Louis Public Schools would sue over this if someone owed me $42 million. But at the same time, if you look at it from the charter school perspective, if you don't believe that you owe that money, you believe that you are entitled to that money, you can see it as very much an attack on the charter schools, especially when the district and charter schools throughout their history have had a lot of tension between the two of them. You could very much see their side of the story as well.
And it's interesting because that tension has eased somewhat in recent years. I mean, I know the city schools has working with the KIPP charter schools. They gave them a building, and now the city schools get to include the scores of KIPP students in their evaluation, which will help them. And just at the point that this cooperation was increasing, to the point that the charter schools backed the city schools when they won a property tax increase last month, 6 days later, the city schools filed the suit. And while, as you say, it wasn't against the charter schools, it's going to hurt the charter schools, and that really destroyed a lot of the trust between the two groups.
Do you think the public school system wants the charter schools out?
That's a very hard question. They say they don't, but if you look at it as a market question, you've got 10,000 students in the city who have chosen charter schools instead of district schools. Would they like to have those students back? Probably. Could they handle them under the infrastructure that they have now? I don't think so.
Let's go to St. Louis University Law School. The dean there, Michael Wolff, who was involved in this as special counsel to then Governor Carnahan. We sat down with him this week as well for his perspective.
I was chief counsel for Governor Carnahan in the first couple of years of his administration, and then I came back to St. Louis U to be teaching, and I was special counsel and assigned specifically to figure out, with a number of other players, what to do both with respect to the state government and also the legislature, because the school district of Kansas City and St. Louis were under federal court desegregation orders, and it was pretty clear from the precedents that were occurring in the United States Supreme Court and in the U.S. Court of Appeals here that the courts were going to get out of the desegregation business at some point. So we needed to figure out, well, how do we transition to a school district that's not operating under federal court order? There were a number of funding mechanisms, because at that time, the amount of state aid that a district could get was based in part on its property tax rate. And so there were two things that the legislature did with that. One is that they created an overlay district on top of the St. Louis School District, because that would allow them to have an additional $2.75 of assessed valuation on their property tax rate, and therefore draw down more aid under the school aid formula. And then the second thing that they did to draw down more state aid was the legislature, knowing that the district voters in the city would probably not approve a property tax increase, authorized the city district to put on the ballot a sales tax proposition, which they did in March of 1999 to get some additional money. The legislation provided that that sales tax money would be converted to an equivalent amount of property tax so that more money would be available under the formula. And then the other piece that's significant for this controversy, is that the same bill, Senate Bill 781, provided for the establishment of charter schools. Now, admittedly, in 1999, when the case was settled, there were no charter schools. They had just been authorized. In fact, I think there was a great deal of resistance by the city school board to anybody starting a charter school. So it took a few years for them to get up and running in any kind of meaningful sense in St. Louis. But the funding mechanism was in the 1998 bill, and that is this charter school for each child would get the state aid for that kid, plus the amount of local property and sales tax effort. So the local taxing effort would be built into that. And the mechanism for doing that was to have the state pay the full per pupil amount, both state aid and local effort, to the charter school directly. And then the amount of the local effort that the state had paid would be deducted from the school district's state aid entitlement. So it was a way of funding charter schools that avoided having to have them wait while the city school district processed or figured out whether or not they were going to pay or whatever. So that was all done by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. In 2005, the legislature rewrote the funding formula. So instead of having money be based on the amount of local tax effort, it was based upon what the legislature defined as adequacy. Adequacy was computed by taking a bunch of well-performing school districts, not the highest, not the lowest, but people that are doing a decent job of educating children, averaging the amount of money they were spending per pupil. And that became the legal definition of adequacy. In part, this is a problem that starts with the legislature being unwilling and unable to fund our public schools across the state adequately, which, I mean, adequacy in a real sense. And what it does is it leaves the local people to fight among themselves. So we get this fight between the St. Louis School District and the charter schools. The amount of public aid, both local tax and state aid, follows the kid. So if you have a school that's educating a kid, you should be entitled to the amount of money that is attributable for that child. So the simplest way to express it is the money follows the kid. When the kid goes to a charter school, the money follows the kid. When the kid goes to an interdistrict transfer program, now they've negotiated different rates than they used to have, but still there's money that follows the kid to provide that child an education. I mean, I really have a great deal of empathy for both the city schools, the NAACP, the Liddell plaintiffs, and the charter schools, because they are all trying, I think, I do not question anybody's good faith. They are trying to educate the children of this city with what is not enough money to really, honest to God, meet the needs of those children. And that is something where the focus ought to be on the legislature, not on an inadequately funded adequacy formula that forces the local people to fight with one another. I guess the simplest thing I can say about public education is there's various pieces of it that look simple, but none of it is simple.
Just a few things we've seen on Twitter. Lisa Clancy weighs in saying that if St. Louis Public School suit prevails, it could be the mass closure of 35 schools, meaning charter schools, serving 70% black children. I'm not okay with that. The lawsuit divides people that should be working together for kids, for funding equity, for a better STL for all. Also, people are asking, I believe it may have been the same person on Twitter asking if it has such a history, why did the public school wait so long to file it? Do we know if it had been filed earlier, would it have been such a big deal if it had been filed 1 or 2 years into this process?
Well, it would have been less money, but I mean, it would have been the same principle.
So is there an argument to be made? I think some would make the argument. Are charter schools in some way fulfilling some of the original goals of desegregation?
I think absolutely. I mean, so first off, if you look at the percentage of white students in the district, I mean, the district is struggling because many white students who live in the city don't attend city schools. I mean, the city has about 43% white residents in the city, but nowhere near 43% of the students are white students in the district. If you look over time, the percentage of white students is dropping and dropping. And it's not until recent years when charter schools started enrolling more white students. That means getting people to stay in the city and integrate the schools. they've started to turn the tide. And if you look at the integration of our public schools in St. Louis, the most well-integrated schools are charter schools. And then the second piece of it, looking at the ballot language from this sales tax initiative, it says for the purpose of improving the primary and secondary educational opportunities for the residents of St. Louis. But you'd be hard pressed to say that charter schools don't fit that bill.
I think it's interesting the way Mike Wolf characterized it, and that's the question. Was this money meant to go to the city school system, or was it meant to go on behalf of the city school students? Students who live in the city and go to public schools in the city. Now that definition has changed. It wasn't, then it was just district schools, now it's district and charter schools. That seems to be the central question.
This is why it's in court. It's you can't figure it out in 30 minutes, I gather.
And I had a smile when Bill Douthit was saying yes. And then the final settlement says, well, obviously it wasn't the final settlement.
And obviously people who, so Bill and Mr. Wolf were all in the same room at the same time. Did they ever anticipate this problem?
Not only that, I mean, Bill Danforth, the former chancellor at Washington University, was the one who helped kind of get everybody together. And when I was writing a story about this a couple of weeks ago, I emailed him and I said, what do you think? He said, I never looked that far in the future to figure out what role the charter schools would play. They really didn't enter my thinking. So it's really a case of an old settlement, an old law, and a new landscape.
Dale Singer, James Schulz, we appreciate your time. We have to leave it there, and we'll see you next week. Thank you both.